For more than half a century, Charles Stanley stood behind the pulpit preaching family values to millions around the world. To the public, he was the rock-solid image of Christian leadership, wise, composed, and unshakable. But behind the sermons and beneath the spotlight, a very different story was unfolding. Behind closed doors, his own family was unraveling. His wife filed for divorce. His son walked away from the church. His daughter watched as everything her father built started to fracture. And now, after his death in 2023, they're finally breaking the silence. What they revealed about his final days shocked even those closest to him. The man who led millions to faith wasn't always the same man at home. And the final 3 words he ever spoke would change everything between him and his son. Charles Stanley was born on September 25, 1932, in the tiny rural town of Dry Fork, Virginia, during the height of the Great Depression. It was a time of breadlines, bankruptcies, and broken dreams. Jobs vanished. Families crumbled. For many, life felt hopeless. His parents, Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, were barely scraping by. Then, just 9 months after Charles was born, tragedy struck. His father died suddenly at just 29 years old. One day he was there, the next gone. No memories, no goodbye, just silence. His mother, now a widow in the worst economic crisis in American history, was left alone to raise a newborn. That experience of sudden loss and absence would haunt Charles for life. He would later speak often about the empty space in his heart, wondering who his father was and who he himself might have become under a father's hand. That longing would shape his theology for decades to come. For Charles, God wasn't just a creator. He was the father who never leaves. At age 9, Rebecca remarried, hoping to give her son the father figure he had lost. But that hope quickly turned into a nightmare. Her new husband, John Hall, was an alcoholic with a violent temper, and within weeks, it became clear he was abusive. What Rebecca didn't know was that Hall's family had tricked her. They told her marriage would settle him down. It didn't. In fact, it made everything worse. Charles lived in constant fear. He saw his stepfather choke his mother. He locked his bedroom door at night, and sometimes even kept a loaded gun by his bed, just in case. He wasn't just a child. He was a survivor in a war zone. That trauma didn't just scar him, it forged him. It drove him to faith and taught him one hard truth. You can't always trust people, but you can trust God. In the midst of the chaos, young Charles found refuge in the church. His Pentecostal roots ran deep. His grandfather, George Washington Stanley, had helped found the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church in Dry Fork. When things got unbearable at home, Charles would slip away to the church basement and cry out to God. He didn't just whisper prayers. He poured them out, loud, desperate, emotional. That raw, passionate spirituality stayed with him for life. Even after becoming a Baptist, that Pentecostal fire never left. It shaped his voice, his preaching, and his leadership. At 17, something happened that changed everything. He visited his grandfather in Siler City, North Carolina, torn about becoming a preacher. "I'm too young, too broken, too weak," he admitted. His grandfather gave him a sentence that became a life motto. "Charles, if God tells you to put your head through a brick wall, you run for it. It's his job to make the hole." That one line became his life's compass. Obey God and leave the consequences to him. In the 1950s, Charles began formal theological training. He studied at the University of Richmond, then Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Texas. These were boom years for Bible colleges. Enrollment tripled after World War II, and evangelism was becoming a national force thanks to rising stars like Billy Graham. By 1957, at just 25 years old, Charles was already pastoring a small mountain church in North Carolina and teaching at a nearby Bible Institute, all for $75 a week. But he didn't care. He wasn't in it for money. He was learning how to reach people in real pain. By 26, he was officially ordained, a rare achievement at such a young age. But Charles wasn't just ahead of his time. He was right on schedule. After years of moving, from Ohio to Miami to Florida, Stanley landed at First Baptist Church of Atlanta in 1969 as associate pastor. But the church was a war zone. Factions were fighting over theology and power. At one meeting, he was physically assaulted. He didn't leave. He stayed for 2 long, painful years. Then, on October 1st, 1971, the congregation voted. It was tense, divided, raw. But the outcome was clear. Charles Stanley would become the 16th senior pastor. And that's when everything changed. In 1972, Stanley launched the Chapel Hour on 2 small local TV stations. It was a modest half-hour show, but it reached 16,000 viewers. That was enough. By 1978, the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, saw something special in Stanley. They offered him a national platform. His audience exploded overnight. His show was rebranded as In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, and within a week, his message was reaching homes across the US. By the early 80s, it was global. By the 2000s, In Touch was translated into 114 languages across 150 countries. His teaching wasn't just being broadcast, it was being lived by millions. But Stanley's legacy wasn't just about TV. It started years earlier, in 1966, when he founded the George Mueller Christian School in Miami. It was more than a school, it was a statement. Named after a man who raised orphans through faith alone, the school reflected Stanley's belief that faith should shape every part of life. He carried that belief into everything he touched. When First Baptist Atlanta outgrew its building in the 1990s, Stanley made the bold choice to move it from historic Midtown to the suburbs of Dunwoody. Critics called it a betrayal of tradition, but Stanley was thinking ahead. The new campus seated 3,000 and became a hub of media, ministry, and outreach. One of the most beloved traditions he led was the Passion Play, a dramatic reenactment of Jesus' final days. From 1977 to 2011, it drew thousands and mobilized hundreds of volunteers. Stanley never stopped innovating. In 1982, he officially incorporated In Touch Ministries, giving him total freedom to grow. He embraced radio syndication, reaching 115 million households in the US. But he didn't stop there. He wanted to reach the most remote places on Earth, even villages with no electricity. So, he created Messenger Lab, 8 solar-powered devices that could play sermons, scripture, and devotionals in multiple languages. Over 1 million of them were distributed worldwide. Even in Antarctica, the estimated value of those devices? Over $26 million. In 2020, after nearly 50 years, Stanley stepped down as senior pastor. By then, First Baptist Atlanta had become a national institution. But even as he retired from leadership, deeper fractures in his personal life began to emerge. After his death in 2023, his family broke their silence. They shared what it was like behind the scenes, the pain, the silence, and the complex legacy of a man loved by millions but struggling at home. And then came the most shocking part. In his final moments, Charles Stanley turned to his son and uttered just 3 words. What he said changed everything between them. His son, who had once walked away from the church, later called those final words the most honest thing my father ever said. What were they? That part, his son says, is between us and God. But what matters more is that for the first time in decades, there was peace. While Charles Stanley's sermons aired on more than 4,000 outlets across radio, television, and satellite, his reach extended far beyond American airwaves. His messages were translated into 127 languages, streamed on mobile apps, digital platforms, podcasts, you name it. All of it driven by one conviction, that this was the greatest moment in history to spread the gospel. And Charles Stanley wasn't just a media pioneer, he was a political force. In 1984, he became president of the Southern Baptist Convention during one of the most divisive chapters in the denomination's history. At the heart of the conflict was biblical inerrancy, the belief that the Bible is completely true in every aspect, including science. Conservatives called their fight the conservative resurgence. Moderates called it a takeover. Stanley won the presidency by the slimmest of margins, just 52% of the vote, but that narrow victory was enough. He served 2 terms from 1984 to 1986, and during that time, he led what became known as the Peace Committee. Formed in 1985 to help resolve the battle, the committee met 15 times and produced a report over 6,400 words long. The report ultimately affirmed the conservative position. From that point forward, the SBC moved in a theologically conservative direction, and Charles Stanley was at the center of that transformation. From a high school in Miami in 1966 to a church fight in 1971, from a local congregation to a global media empire in the 1980s, Stanley was always moving forward. And by February 1988, he stood at the peak of his public influence. That month, he was inducted into the National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame, a milestone in a career already reaching into over 115 million households across America. In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley had become a fixture on Christian radio and television. He wasn't just another preacher, he was a voice shaping the future of Christian media. But while the world was celebrating him, something darker was unfolding behind the scenes. In 1989, while in Kansas City for a ministry rally, Stanley found himself alone in his hotel room, praying. He looked out the window and noticed dozens of satellite dishes on rooftops. In that quiet moment, he said God spoke to him. This would be the way to send the gospel across the globe. He remembered Psalm 67 verse 2, "Send us around the world with the news of your saving power." That moment became a defining one. His sermons would go on to be translated into 127 languages, broadcast on over 4,000 platforms worldwide. But while the message was spreading, the man delivering it was beginning to fracture. At home, his wife Anna felt more and more abandoned. Charles was gone constantly, traveling, preaching, expanding his ministry. He chose his priorities, Anna once said, and I have not been one of them. She wasn't bitter. She was tired from years of emotional neglect. By the early 1990s, Anna had stopped attending his services altogether. Their son, Andy, who would one day become a prominent pastor in his own right, watched it all unfold. The silence, the distance, the slow unraveling of a marriage nearly 4 decades long. In June 1993, Anna filed for divorce. She didn't use her full name, just A.J. Stanley, but everyone knew who she was. The petition said their marriage was irretrievably broken. The evangelical world was stunned. This was Charles Stanley, the man who preached family values every Sunday. Now, his own marriage was breaking down in front of millions. The backlash was swift. Some pastors distanced themselves. Others demanded he resign. But the controversy wasn't just about the divorce, it was about the image. Stanley had built his reputation on principles he now appeared to be struggling to uphold. Anna eventually withdrew the petition, hoping for reconciliation. When that failed, she refiled in 1995. For 7 long years, the Stanleys remained in painful limbo, still married on paper, emotionally separated, and publicly dissected. Radio stations pulled his sermons. Church leaders quietly urged him to step down. But Stanley kept going. Week after week, he took the pulpit, not just out of persistence, but out of quiet defiance. The Southern Baptist Convention, where he had once served as president, watched in discomfort. The man who had championed Christian family values had now lost his family. Anna never remarried. She died in 2014. Charles never took another wife. His church's bylaws allowed him to stay as pastor only if he remained single. When the final divorce papers were signed, he addressed his congregation calmly. God has assured me I'm where He wants me to be, doing what He has called me to do. And then something remarkable happened. The church backed him. The board of deacons voted overwhelmingly to keep him in place. In 1995, Andy Stanley, his son, started his own church, North Point Community Church. It wasn't just a new building. It was a bold new approach. Atlanta doesn't need another church, Andy said. What it needs is a safe place for the unchurched. That was more than a mission, it was a statement. A not-so-subtle challenge to the world his father had built. By the end of North Point's first year, over 4,000 people were attending. Today, the church reaches more than 43,000 across multiple campuses. It became a movement of its own. But for all their growth and public success, Charles and Andy had to work for healing privately. They began counseling, week after week, honest conversations, difficult truths. In one session, Andy asked the counselor, "When do I give up on my dad?" In his final years, Charles no longer preached from stages, but he had a favorite chair by the window. That chair became sacred. He would sit there, pray, and reflect. Andy described those visits as precious beyond words. It hadn't always been that way. There had been years of silent dinners and distant stares, two men sharing a table but not their hearts. But healing came, and with it, words Charles had never said before. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." Andy said those words carried extraordinary weight, not just because of who said them, but because of everything that had come before. At 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18, 2023, Charles Stanley passed away. He was 90 years old. His ministry began at age 14. It spanned continents, decades, and generations. He preached for 66 years. He led First Baptist Atlanta for 50 of them. His sermons aired on 2,800 radio and TV outlets in 150 countries. They were translated into 114 languages. His daughter Becky, who had quietly stayed close through it all, was there when he passed. In the obituary, her name was listed alongside Andy's. In Touch Ministries didn't just survive the scandal, it grew into one of the most influential evangelical networks in history. What started as the Chapel Hour in 1972, by 2017, was being broadcast on over 2,800 stations, reaching audiences in 150 countries and 500 US radio markets. But behind the success was a man who had lived his message. Charles Stanley was raised by an alcoholic stepfather. That experience gave him a survival instinct, fierce, unyielding. It made him a powerhouse in the pulpit, but it also made him difficult at home. That tension didn't weaken his message, it humanized it. He preached about healing, but had to learn how to live it. Andy took theological positions that stirred controversy. He challenged tradition, but his father never lashed out, never corrected him in public. Instead, Charles Stanley chose love. Again and again, he said the words his son had longed to hear. "I couldn't be prouder of you." They were his final words to Andy, and they said everything